We want to start by just kind of going over the values that we talked about at the beginning last time. I think this is important. I mean, this kind of should be a part of any, class discussion, but especially with this topic, I think it's good to have the reminder that first of all, so our values were PORG, prayer, openness, respect, and grace. So first prayer that this is, we're doing this not just talk about an interesting topic, but to try and understand what God is trying to speak to us. And we will open with prayer and invite God to be leading us through this. So it's not just me, but that God is with us in this process. And openness, that as we talk about things that are challenging and maybe have different perspectives than what we'd heard before or assumed, that we have an open mind. Doesn't mean we have to agree with everything. That's perfectly fine. That if you disagree in some ways, but we want to be willing to listen, right, and not just shut different ideas out immediately. And then respect, right, as we talk with each other, that we do so respectfully, even if we do disagree. Right? I feel like last week we had some disagreements, but it was respectful, and so I really appreciate that, and I hope we continue that. And then along with that is the idea of grace, that that we do give each other grace, that we're all growing in this, that we offer forgiveness and accept forgiveness when we feel that's needed. And along with that, as we think about prayer and centering this on God, after we've had our class time, we're going to let people go if they want, but then we're going to take about 10 minutes to have kind of a time of spiritual practice or prayer for those that are interested, just to kind of get our hearts and minds centered on God again. Hopefully they're not going to be off God through this, but to remind us that we're doing this in light of that. So we'll be doing some prayers or practices that we learned last year when I was teaching about those things. So if that interests you, you can stick around. If it doesn't, it's perfectly fine. It's hard enough to keep it to an hour anyway, so I want to make sure we do that and respect your time. So with that in mind, let's go to God in prayer. God, we thank you for today, that this is another day we can enjoy life in your creation. We thank you for all the ways that you bless us that we so often take for granted. I'm thankful for this church and this community that cares about one another and cares about your will for this world. And I pray that our time together is a part of that we grow closer to each other, that we learn how to love others more and more in the world around us. But even as we do look at the world around us, we see many things that trouble us that are not as we wish they would be. And so we want to lift up these requests that have been mentioned tonight. We pray for everyone that's affected by all the natural disasters, the wildfires, the hurricanes, tornadoes, all these things, that you would put an end to those, that you would work with and help with those who are fighting against these things, that you keep everyone safe, especially Don has mentioned his daughter and son-in-law who are traveling, that you would be with them particularly, but that you would be working through all this. We pray for those who are hurting, especially Daryl, we're mindful of tonight with his knee and the recovery, and it looks like it's a long process, Lord, and I know, Lord, none of us want to wait or be patient when we're enduring hard things, and so I pray that you do work quickly, and that through that you give Daryl the patience and strength that he needs to continue there. We pray for those who are dealing with loss, like Jonah's friend June, who is dealing with cancer, for Lacey's coworker Hannah, whose son has just passed. And also we pray for Charlotte's neighbor Dan, who's going through surgery and having stents put in. All these things are so hard on us, and so we pray for healing, that you would work in those situations. And when there is loss, that you would bring comfort to those who are grieving. And Lord, I pray that we be people who work for healing. If we don't have the magic wands, we can't touch people with and heal them like Jesus could. But I pray that we find ways to still bless people in the midst of their pain, whatever it might be. And we do this not on our own strength, but the power of your Spirit and in the name of your Son. And so we offer this prayer in his name. Amen. All right. So just to recap a little bit from last week, I think most people were here. I hope maybe you got a chance to watch over the last week. Oh, got a couple more people I need to let in. You know, one of the things that Anna Jane said was, you know, I wish there was another word besides racist, right? Because as we talked about last week, when you hear that word, that brings up lots of images and images that are not comfortable for us. You know, images of slave traders, as we'll see some tonight, of the Ku Klux Klan and other acts of violence. And we don't want to just, you know, when we talk about racism and what we're dealing with today in whatever way, we don't want people to feel like that's just lumping all that together, that, you know, that we're all as bad as those people. Obviously, I know many of you lived through a lot of those things, and you know that it is a lot better than it used to be. And so, you know, we want to be careful with how we use that term and not label each other. And I hope it doesn't feel like I'm labeling us all that way. To me, I think a better way of thinking about this is that it's not about racist people, it's about racist ideas. And those ideas are often believed by people. That's what we're working with and working against here is these ideas. And often they're ideas that are in the air, right? It may be not that we sat down or anybody sat down and reasoned out, here's why I should, you know, hate these people or do this to these people. It's so often it's in the air, it's unconscious. And so we want to be aware of them. That's part of what this is doing. And so we're here to dismantle these ideas, not to take down people, not to judge people. Even as we look at, we'll see tonight, people in history that made some, I would say, very harmful choices, we're still focusing on the ideas and how we can deal with those. To me, it's about, it's very similar to what Paul says in Ephesians 6 about spiritual warfare, right? That our battle is not against flesh and blood, it's against the powers and authorities, right? These, again, the ideas, the things that are in the air. And so I think this is a similar thing, what we're trying to do here. And also last week, the introduction was kind of just presenting the thesis or the big idea behind it. And now, since we're getting into the history, we'll start to see if that case holds up, right? The case that was made last week is going to be seen as we look at the history. So, you know, if you disagreed last week, that's fine. And we'll see if looking at history gives more insight into that. That's the whole point, right? So it's really, this is where we're getting into the meat of what we're here to do, to look at the history of the church and how we have and haven't responded to racism and what that means for us today. All right, so let's get to our video. It's about 20 minutes long. And again, I've got you muted, but you can text me if there's problems. I didn't realize last week that you would still see me as you're watching the video. So I thought I wasn't picking my nose or anything last time. But I will be aware of that. If it seems like I'm not paying attention, I did watch this just earlier today. So that's that. All right, so I'm going to share the screen and then start the video, and then we'll come back and discuss. 1 second. Okay, here we go.
Historical research, you come across hundreds of facts, but sometimes a few of them stick. And I remember one of the most stunning moments of realization for me when it comes to race in the church happened on a visit that I took to Colonial, Virginia. It was a museum in Williamsburg, and there was a plaque on the wall, and it said that in 1667, the Virginia Assembly passed a statute that essentially said if someone was baptized, it would not free them. The exact words were, "It is enacted by this grand assembly and the authority thereof that the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom." And it was referring to Native Americans, Africans, and people of mixed race descent. Now, this fact stood out to me for two reasons. First of all, you have race, religion, and politics intertwined. And what that means is you can't draw these very sharp lines between these issues. Race, religion, and politics are all wrapped up in the same social bond. The second reason it stands out is that this is 1667. It's 100 years before the Declaration of Independence, more than a century before the ratification of the Constitution. These issues predate the political entity known as the United States. So guess what? There's never not a time in our nation's history when issues of racism and religion weren't intertwined in problematic ways. Now, what does this have to do with Christianity? Think about it. The Virginia Assembly was actually a group of Anglican white men. And so you had to be a member of a church in good standing if you wanted to serve in political office at this time. Moreover, they were violating what they already were used to. So English custom said that Christians could not enslave one another. But in North America, no such rules applied when it came to Native Americans or people of African descent in the colonies. But what stands out to me as well is this. They could have made another decision. Here's one big idea that you have to understand when we talk about the academic study of history. Nothing about American racism was inevitable. Historians talk about the idea of contingency. And it's the principle that individuals and groups have agency. They can make their own decisions, and despite what decisions they actually did make, oftentimes they could have made other decisions, and events would have unfolded differently. Contingency is a crucial idea for understanding race. Early in the years of European colonization of North America, colonists hadn't cemented the idea of skin color as an essential feature of society. Race was still being made. So this segment traces the early days of European contact with indigenous peoples of North America and the first days of slavery in the colonies. It shows how people with power chose dividends over dignity and laid the foundations for race-based stratification. But the idea of contingency also gives us hope. If people made deliberate decisions to enshrine racism in our nation's society, then it's possible that a series of better decisions could begin to change this reality. Let's go back to the beginning of European contact with North America. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We all remember that, right? Well, let's dig a little bit deeper. After about 2 months of sailing, Columbus and his companions made landfall on the shores of the Western Atlantic. Mind you, this was not uninhabited land. There were thriving Native American tribes and cultures. But the idea is that race had to be constructed, socially constructed. Race actually has no basis in biology or the Bible. The amount of melanin in someone's skin does not determine their worth. The Bible doesn't set up some people as having more dignity than others. Meaning had to be made around skin color. It had to be created. But just because race is based on a myth doesn't mean it doesn't have real consequences. See, racial ideas formed over time, and we can begin to see this clearly in the colonial era. This is a period when people were still deciding how society would be organized. You can see the gradual growth of race as a determining factor of who gained advantages and disadvantages. So back to Columbus. We have some letters from his early days of contact with North America, and we can see from the start that there were some racist ideas embedded in them. So when he looked at Native Americans, he described their appearance in relation to European features. And basically what it boiled down to was the lighter the skin, the more preferable the people, because they looked more like Europeans. Now, it's not inherently racist to compare appearances, but Columbus goes on. So he saw the indigenous inhabitants and he thought they would be good servants. He says, they were intelligent, for I observed that they took in what I said to them, and I believed that they would easily be made Christians, as it appeared to me they had no religion. Now break that down. He looked at Native Americans and evaluated their intelligence, but only in relation to how good of a servant they would be. He couldn't envision another role for them in society. And then he goes on to say that they could easily be made Christian. as if they didn't already have a sophisticated culture and cosmology and spirituality of their own. Now, let's be clear. Native Americans did resist European colonization. Historian Richard White talks about the middle ground, and this is a period when whites could neither dictate to Indians nor ignore them. But Native Americans, of course, were eventually decimated by disease and war and displacement, and European colonization began to be a more prominent story in American history. Europeans colonized other lands for a purpose. It was to make money. European countries demanded more and more raw materials from their colonies, and in response, colonizers increasingly turned to slavery. Let's talk about slavery a little bit, because I'm concerned that when we say that word, too many of us fail to understand exactly what it looked like. We need to realize the toll in terms of human brutality and suffering that American race-based chattel slavery extracted on all involved, not just people of African descent. First, the demand for raw materials in the Americas fueled the growth in the slave trade. Now, we'll come back to this later on, but it's critical to realize that the pursuit of profit was the platform on which the edifice of slavery was built. Let's start with the so-called Middle Passage. This is the journey of enslaved persons on slave ships from the coast of Africa to places in South, Central, and North America. There's a process to enslavement, and the Middle Passage actually began before anyone stepped foot on a ship. You see, Europeans would get slaves from the continent of Africa, usually the western part of the continent. And to get slaves, they would barter with local African tribes for people who were captured in war, which was a common practice at the time, or they kidnapped their own people. And then they marched them, sometimes hundreds of miles in chains and shackles to the coast. So already the sense of imprisonment and displacement and bondage is happening. And then they would take them to the coast and they would wait weeks in structures called factories, which were these fortress-like prisons designed to hold Africans until they were loaded onto ships. Now, there is some record of what this looked like, and we have this through the narratives that enslaved people wrote about their own lives. Now, one of these narratives stands out, and it's called The Narrative of the Life of Aula Uda Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa. Now, Equiano was born in 1745 in Africa. He was of the Igbo tribe in modern-day Nigeria, and he was kidnapped when he was about 11 years old, along with his sister. And he writes about the Middle Passage. Actually, he writes about when they were on the coast, and he said, "The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there any time." And then he goes on to describe when you're on a ship like this, there's no place for the waste to go. And so they had these big tubs of excrement. And he describes that the children would often fall into these big tubs and were almost suffocated. Now, what's interesting is, in spite of all this, Equiano converted to Christianity. And he spoke of his experiences from a Christian framework. He talked about rape. And he said, "It's a disgrace, not only for Christians, but of men. I have even known them to gratify their brutal passion with females not yet 10 years old." Beyond that, he talked about kidnapping and separation from family. Like I said, he was kidnapped along with his sister. And when you enslaved people, it didn't matter if you were bonded, mother and children and wives and husbands, you could be separated. And Ola Uda Equiano said, "O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you?" So he could see the inconsistencies and hypocrisies of people who professed to be Christian, yet treated people as property. Let's talk about someone who we all know, but you may not know you know him. You know probably the song Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Do you know who wrote it? It's a man named John Newton, and he's best known for penning that amazing hymn that we all sing in so many of these churches. What many people don't know is that he also served as a slave ship captain for several years. So, John Newton converted to Christianity in 1748, but he remained a slave ship captain until a stroke in 1754 forced him to retire from life on the sea. He went on to be a very well-known pastor, hymn writer, preacher, and many years later, 30 years later, he wrote a little pamphlet called Thoughts on the African Slave Trade, and it was written to help abolish the slave trade in England. In that pamphlet, John Newton wrote, "I hope it will always be a subject of humiliating reflection to me that I was once an active instrument in a business at which my heart now shudders." You see, Newton changed his mind. He repented of his days as a slave ship captain. But what makes Newton remarkable as a Christian is not that he was engaged in the slave trade, but that he stopped and later repented. You see, if he had simply remained a slave ship captain, we might never have known about him. And that speaks to how few people actually changed their minds and switched paths on the issue of racism and enslavement. Now, you have to understand more about slavery. So we think about the Middle Passage and we think, well, once they get across the ocean, that's it. They're sold and they go work on plantations. Well, it wasn't quite that simple. You see, they arrived oftentimes in the Caribbean islands and people would buy human beings, but in small batches. And so folks would go from port to port to port, trying to sell as many enslaved people as possible so that journey could last weeks and months longer than whatever it took you to get across the Atlantic. And then speaking of selling human beings, in one particularly egregious example of how we treated human beings as less than human, there was something called the scramble. And so they would put all enslaved persons in this big pen, and it would be locked up and there would be walls so nobody could get out. But then at a certain point, all of the potential buyers, who were white men, they would gather outside the pen, and then someone would ring a bell or shout a word to start, and then people would rush in to this, and this is why they call it a scramble, and they would grab however many human beings they wanted to buy as slaves. And this is a particularly dehumanizing way of selling people. And not only that, once you were sold into another person's ownership, so to speak, you had to be seasoned. This is conditioning to get you ready for life as an enslaved person in a new land. So you had to learn new language. You had to be trained for whatever particular work that you would be doing. And this was a very grueling period. Folks were exposed to new diseases. They were depressed because they were taken from their homelands. They're doing hard, rigorous work for no pay. And many enslaved persons died within the first 3 years. So the story of North American slavery is not the same as everywhere else. Britain, for instance, they abolished the slave trade in 1807 and then slavery itself in 1833. But that doesn't mean they were completely done with it. You see, there was the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and that fed an astronomical demand for raw material. Cotton demand, for instance, grew 20 times during the Industrial Revolution. And that was cotton that was supplied from colonies. As we look more deeply at the North American story of enslavement, one of the historical landmarks that historians have is 1619. That's the year when a Dutch trading ship brought, quote, 20 and odd Negroes to the coast of Colonial Virginia. Now, what's a little bit ironic is that the Dutch had stolen these Africans from a Portuguese ship. And the ship was named the São João Bautista, or in English, St. John the Baptist. So again, we're getting these Christian and enslavement interactions again. Now, Europeans had been enslaving Africans in places like Haiti and Jamaica for 100 years, but this marked one of the clearest beginnings of slavery in colonial North America. Slavery gradually took form. In the early days, it looked more like indentured servitude. It was unfree labor, but with indentured servants, most of the time you could marry, you could save money, and of course you could work your way out after a period of years. And early on in the colonial era, Africans were considered potential members of the community on an equal basis with other Europeans. Now, this wasn't uniformly the case, but it was the idea that, are these indentured servants? Are these citizens? Are they something else? But over time, those questions gradually coalesced into what we now recognize as American race-based chattel slavery. Now, there were some causes for those changes, and we got to understand the context because, again, it's the idea that not only slavery is being created, but ideas of race are being created. So there was Bacon's Rebellion, and what that taught the powers that be was the danger of indentured servants rebelling. And so they clamped down and didn't want indentured servants banding together, often across racial lines, in order to foment rebellion. Another factor was a longer life expectancy of slaves. That meant that they were worth the investment. And then lastly, a slow rate of Europeans arriving to the colonies meant that there was a need for labor and Europeans couldn't always supply it, so they looked to African enslaved labor. Slavery got more and more regulated over time. You have something called the Slave Code, and that a person would be determined slave or free based on the mother's status. Now, this is different because typically a child's status would be based on the father. And then there were other factors. They regulated slavery and made it slavery for life. There was no possibility of working your way out in most cases. And they also forbade formal marriage. Now, sometimes people would partner up or have informal ceremonies, but nothing that the authorities had to respect. Now, in the midst of this, Christians, European Christians, wanted to proselytize to the enslaved, Native Americans, Africans, people of mixed race and ethnicity. In a book called The Baptism of Early Virginia by historian Rebecca Ann Getz, she talks about the concept of hereditary heathenism. Just as a parent can pass down genetic traits to their child, the idea of hereditary heathenism is that parents pass down their religion to their child. And so here we get to see how in the colonial era, race becomes tethered to religion. Because what it essentially meant was that Christian equals European and heathen equals Native American or African. So there's a compelling illustration of this with John Rolfe, who was British, and Metawaka, who was a Native American princess. They got married, and you may know Metawaka better by another name, Pocahontas. Now, what happened was they got married, Metawaka becomes Christian, John Rolfe and she have a child together, and they go back to Europe. And basically, John Rolfe is showing off and saying, see, here's this Native American woman. She marries an upstanding European man. They have a child together, and she becomes a Christian. In other words, there's the possibility that the native inhabitants can become more like Europeans, also adopting religion of the colonizers. And so there's this possibility of Native Americans entering into European society if they take on the right traits. Now, that wasn't always the case. It certainly wasn't in a case of equality for Native Americans, but it was even interesting that Africans never really had such a possibility of becoming white or European as people of other races and ethnicities may have at one time been thought of. What happened with Africans was Christians from Europe still tried to evangelize them. Now, it bears mention that Africans had already been exposed to Christianity. Christianity in Africa predates Christianity in Europe, but many Europeans thought that they were introducing Africans for the first time to Christianity. And so they wanted to evangelize Africans. There was something called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. It was a missionary agency. And there's one missionary in particular whose story, I think, helps us understand the way race and religion intertwined in the way that Europeans compromised with racism when it came to Christianity. The missionary's name was Francis Lejeune. And he went to South Carolina from 1706 until his death in 1717 to evangelize not only Africans, but also Native Americans and anyone who was there. Now, he was passionate about evangelizing, but he also knew that he had to satisfy the plantation owner class. And they were concerned that if you started baptizing people of African descent, well, they're going to get these ideas about freedom and liberty and equality. And we can't have that because we need them to be obedient servants. So here's what Lajau did. When he did get Africans to convert, he had them baptized, and their baptismal vows said this: "You declare in the presence of God and before this congregation that you do."
Sorry, everyone.
Can you start over? I'm confused.
It jumps to the next one before it's done. All right, I'm gonna see if I can get back to the other one, because that last part is actually technology, right? All right, hope you're all with me. This is part of the fun. Okay, try that again, get this last little bit. I want us to hear this quote about baptism and how it was used. I think that's important. So, I did get a screenshot of it, so if this won't come up, then I can at least show you that, because it's looks like it's having difficulty. Okay, well, never mind. Sorry about that, everybody. This is technology. We do what we can. All right. Okay, so like I said, let me see if I can pull that up real quick. Because like I said, we'll get into the discussion. That's one of the topics I want to talk about, because I know baptism is a very important thing to us, and so we'll make sure that we're understanding how they were using it and how we think it should be used. All right. Before we get to our questions, I did want to kind of go over a couple of things that he talked about. I mean, obviously there's so much. I think it was mentioned last week that this is meant to be the start of a discussion, and I hopefully you all discuss with each other. I'm always happy to talk with anyone about more of this, because there is more than we can touch on. But this idea of creating race, or that race is a social construct, as some would put it. Because I remember when I first heard that kind of language, I thought, well, that's silly, right? Because you can just see that some people obviously look different from each other, right? That some people have lighter skin, some people have darker skin, and so race just seemed like a natural thing. And so we need to see what they're talking about here, that skin color is not the same as the concept of race, right? There have always been people with different skin colors, and people have always noticed that. But the idea of dividing people into different races, that's something that came along later. And so, as he says in the video, meaning had to be created around skin color, right? And that meaning has to do with hierarchy and prejudices. It's not just that, right? So it's the idea of creating, people have different skin colors, and that means something about what they're like, what kind of people they are. That's what we mean by saying race is a construct. It's also helpful, he doesn't say this in the video, but I think it's helpful to talk about the difference in race and ethnicity, right? We often tend to use those words as synonyms, right? As basically meaning the same thing. But ethnicity, that's something that people have always talked about. In fact, the word ethnic comes from the Greek word ethnos, which is what in the New Testament they used to refer to the nations or the Gentiles, right? So there's always been different people groups, and people obviously throughout history have known that and fought a lot of wars about that and that sort of thing. But that's different from race, right? So a good example of understanding the difference here is, would you say that Irish people and German people and Italian people are the same, right? Now, I don't want to think stereotypes, you don't have to offer yours up, but we would say that those groups of people are fairly different ethnically, right? There's different foods and those sort of things. But if you're talking in terms of race, then that's when you would say, no, those are all the same because those groups are all white, right? But it wasn't until, as we're seeing in this period, that the idea that you could lump those people together as the same race, that is something that came about during this time. And then on the flip side, thinking about the difference in race and ethnicity and how we understand it even today, would you say that Nigerians and Ethiopians and South Africans are the same? We could probably say no, but at least in my case, and probably for a lot of us, we can't really tell you what the differences are, right? We just assume there's a uniform culture, and then we label all of them as Black, right? So that's just to help you see the difference in race and ethnicity, what we mean when we say that race is an idea that was created. And, putting this again in a theological light, which is what we're trying to do here, we see that God did create us different, right? Different skin tones, and different cultures, different ways of expressing that. We've mentioned before already the Revelation passage that in the end, that you see people from all these different groups, all the nations, all the ethnicities are there. So God created us that way, and that's a good thing. But God did not create us with hierarchy. We're all made in the image of God. And the idea of race, as it's being used and created here, is creating that hierarchy and not having equality. Right? As he said in the video, the Bible does not set up some people as having more dignity than others. And so there's a unity through diversity. That's how we see God working. And then the other part, I don't think I had mentioned this yet, but we're not going to watch the video for chapter 3. And so I just want to summarize a few things there, because a lot of it did get covered in this, at least the important things. It covers the revolutionary period in our country, which is important historically, but not as much as relevant for our discussion. The main thing that he pointed out is some similar things that we saw here, and we'll talk about in a minute, is how sometimes the American ideals that we all believe in and love don't always line up with reality, right? That we had people who were fighting for freedom while they were enslaving Black men and women. And we had people arguing for equality, universal equality, right? All men, while they're also creating this racial hierarchy that's creating inequalities, right? And so we have to acknowledge that, right? And we do want to praise the ideals and the good that those people did in that period, and yet acknowledge how they weren't always consistent. That's something we'll talk about in just a minute. And then there's, in the next chapter, more of the conversation about should slaves be converted, right? That was that quote that I was trying to get us back to, and I thought I had screenshotted, and am not finding it at the moment. But basically the idea was that you could, it's okay to baptize someone because that doesn't mean you have to free them, right? That was the argument that was going on at the time. And that carries on in, there was something called the Great Awakening in this period, where there was a big religious revival, and a lot of people were becoming Christians. And there were some famous preachers. The most notable is Jonathan Edwards, and others like George Whitefield. And as they were bringing all these people to Christ, they were starting to present a form of the gospel where it was all about personal interior change, right? About saving souls, and not really worrying as much about social problems. Right? It's all about the individual and not as much about institutions and structures, right? Which fits with America, right? We're very individualistic. And so that approach to faith tracks with how we understand things. And so I just want to read a quote here from the end of that chapter, and then we'll get into our discussion. It says, in one of American history's clearest contradictions, not even revolutionary ideals of independence and equality or the religious transformations brought on by the Great Awakening could deconstruct the foundations of the social pyramid. Instead, slavery and the meaning of race became more institutionalized as the country progressed through the opening decades of the 19th century. So that gets into our discussion here. So if we'll try and raise hands, or you can actually, there's a button you can push to digitally raise your hand, and we'll try and discuss this here. And I'll try and share the questions if I can with the screen sharing, which always only sort of works. The first question I want us to think about is, let's see, how did you feel about the way that baptism was offered for slaves, right? In a quote, I don't think we actually got to hear it because it skipped it, is God can have your soul, but you can keep your body. If you had lived then, could you reconcile calling a slave a brother and sister in Christ, but then continuing to own them? So how did you feel about how baptism was used as kind of a tool to enforce slavery and those sort of things? All right. See, Heather. It says Heather raised her hand. So, all right. What did you think? Am I unmuting?
Um, I guess I think the easy answer that, I mean, for us looking back on it now, we all think, well, that's bad, you know, like they shouldn't have been enslaving people, obviously, in the first place. And we can look back and see pretty clearly um, that the reason that they came up with the separate baptism for enslaved people was not because they thought that that was what was best for them spiritually, but just to appease the wealthy plantation owners or anybody who would have owned them. So again, like easily for us now looking back, we can say, yeah, no, that was obviously very bad. But I don't know.
And again, I don't know how much it cut off, if you got to read the quote, if you're a fast reader, but basically when they had their baptismal vows, right, what they would say as they're going into the water, they had to say that I acknowledge that this saves my soul, but does not change my status as a slave, right? Which, you know, I don't remember including anything like that in my baptism. All right, see Kaylee's got her hand up. How do you feel about how baptism was used?
So obviously it was something that that it was something that the white Americans were using for their own advantage. It was pretty clear what the right decision was. In fact, I think a lot of times we think everyone in that time period agreed with slavery. No one was fighting it, but that's just not true. 20 of the 39 founding fathers voted to abolish slavery at the institution of the country. So it's just not true that there was no argument against it. People were seen the opposing side and choosing to own slaves anyway. However, that human nature to distort the Bible into what works for you, what serves your own interests, I think that goes back all the way. I mean, in 2 Timothy, he said that people will accumulate for themselves teachers who suit their own interests and turn away from the truth. And Galatians talk about there are many among you who want to distort the gospel of Christ to their own passions. So for a long time, people have been taking the Bible, taking the words of Christ and manipulating it for what they want, the false teaching that works for what's going to benefit them and their interests. So it's horrifying. I certainly hope none of us would have engaged in it. There were people at the time fighting against it, but I also think that it is part of human nature, and there are certainly Christians who still do that today, who twist the words of God to allow themselves to harm others for their own benefit.
Yeah, thanks. And next week we'll talk some. We're actually going to get into scripture and see, like, how were they using the Bible to justify slavery, and then how were others using it to fight against it, right? And how we use that today, right? How we use the Bible is a very important question all the time. And like you said, we always have to watch, where's my self-interest in this, and am I ignoring things for my own benefit because it'll, in this case, benefit me financially, or those sort of things. All right, one more, Andrew, and then we'll go to the next question. How did you feel about baptism and how that was used?
So me and Chris actually talked about this a little bit earlier today, and it was kind of surprising, right? Like, I think for me, when I think of the church and racism, like, a lot of it's more of like silence than it is necessarily like direct things to, be a part of it. Like, that's, how I've seen it in a lot of ways. And obviously I've learned a lot of things just in some of the things I've read as well. But, when Chris kind of gave this example of what we're going to talk about tonight, I was just like, wow, like, it was just very direct in, let us, as the others have said, like, let us make this baptism in a way that is for gain and to continue that oppression. And I don't know, it just, like, it was one of those things that I feel like even in movies a lot of times that I see or something like that, it's more of, just turning a blind eye than it is direct involvement. And here in this way, it was very directly involved, which, was a little jarring to me. And just, yeah, that's kind of, I guess, my view on it.
Right, thanks. All right, so the next question is I think still kind of related to this one that we're talking about here with, you know, how baptism is used. Uh, okay, Zoom was starting to be weird. I was getting nervous. All right, so the second question kind of related to that is, you know, during this period, as I mentioned, the church began to focus on the conversion of individual souls and ignored earthly freedom and wholeness. So how do we balance both aspects of the gospel, right? A gospel that cares about the life to come, but also cares about life here. You know, as Jesus says, he came to give life to the full, and I think that includes all of it, right? So how do we balance both as we understand the gospel? Oh yeah, Stephen.
Hey, yeah. So this is a really this is a difficult question. I feel a lot of sympathy for the people back then too, because I mean, if you're looking at all these poor people on the plantations that are living this life of misery, and part of you wants to reach out and say, "There's hope. It's Jesus Christ. You have hope in Jesus Christ."
Yeah.
But the slave owner's not going to let you talk to those people unless you agree that, well, they need to know that they're still slaves. That's not quite as easy a call as it sounds. I mean, do you say, well, gosh, I guess it just sucks to be them. They're just not going to know about Jesus until I can abolish slavery? Or do you go in at night and try to do a secret meet? I mean,
Right.
the options are there. And as far as like, you know, the overall social movement, that's difficult too, because Jesus left all the social structures in place. He didn't tear those things down. I mean, they even came to him and said, "Hey, what should we be paying these taxes to Caesar?" And that was an incredibly corrupt
Yeah.
practice that was typically occupied by people who were themselves doing, you know, potentially vile things. And they wanted Jesus to say, "Condemn these people, tell them that they're doing wrong."
Or
And
start right. Yeah.
he wouldn't do it. He wanted to, well, I think Jesus really is trying to say we need to change people first and the systems will follow, rather than let's change all the systems and hope the people follow. I, I think in practice, if you change all the systems, but the people haven't changed, well, yeah, you know, a law is only as good as the people enforcing it, right?
Yeah, and so maybe part of it is just seeing, is seeing the connection. But yeah, I think you really touch on something of, you know, it does give hope, right? That's why we don't want to discount the hope of a life after this, and that was sometimes the only hope that those people had. And I don't know if he gets into it later, but you know, the spirituals, those songs that the slaves would we still know today. That's the theme of so many of them is, you know, I'm just hoping for this next life, and using all that. And again, thinking of how, you know, the structures today, and how we yeah, I mean, the structures are made by people, like laws are made by people, and so they're still always connected. All right, Bob, do you have a question or comment on this idea of how we balance what the gospel looks like? Yeah, Bob.
What church are they talking about?
Yeah, I think they just mean the church in general.
That's right, and that's not correct.
Right, and so it's, I mean, churches of Christ were still, and now I have to go to that history, but it was only kind of getting started then, and it was kind of during this period. So, you know, how you understand
I think it came over. Yeah, I think it came over with the people from England.
Yeah, I mean, that European faith was very much tied to social structures, and I mean, it's a kind of similar thing what happened with the Protestant Reformation, that so many they couldn't change their views on baptism because it was tied into, well, that's what makes you a citizen, right? And so when others came along and said, no, baptism is for adults, that really challenged things. And so I think that's more what they were talking about here. But yeah, it's all complicated in how religion and society are tied up, and you see them struggling with that here too. All right, well, I want to be done in about an hour, so let's move to our last question. Thanks, Bob. So last thing is something that, you know, we've mentioned already, but it's this question of consistency, right? He pointed out the hypocrisy of ships that were named after saints, or there's others that are named after Christian concepts that are transporting African people into slavery. And then, as we mentioned, the next chapter where the words "all men are created equal" written by someone who owned slaves. So, and we had a quote of a Black Christian who said, "Doesn't your own Lord say, 'Do unto others'?" Right? He could see the contradiction. So why could they see it, the Black Christians, but not some of the white Christians couldn't? Again, we don't want to lump them together, right? But many of these slaveholding white Christians, they couldn't see the contradiction. And how can we be consistent today? So we'll only have time for a couple responses, but who wants to talk about this? All right. All right, Heather's got her hand up. I don't even know how to do the raise and lower hand thing. All right.
I just
Heather and then
that.
Charlotte.
I mean, I think it's like with the last question and this one, it's just there's not really any way for me and my brain to find a way that it was right, because it's so obvious that the only reason that they were doing that was to help out wealthy slave owners. And so there's no consistency. I'm sure that they could see that what they were doing was wrong, but there were just other things that were more important. So I don't think they just didn't realize that they were accidentally treating other humans as less than. I just think that they didn't care enough. And as far as for us trying to figure out if we're doing that or not, just having these sort of discussions, I think, is the way to make sure. Obviously, again, the levels of racism in our society now are much, much more subtle. There's nothing nearly like that. Like you said earlier, just amazing strides have been made, but that doesn't mean that the work is done. And for us to make sure that we're being consistent with how we view ourselves compared to other people is just always looking inward and questioning all of our motives and all of our thoughts when we're just existing.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, right, that's not limited to just this issue, this idea of trying to be consistent in what we say and what we do and what we believe and how we act, right? One way to understand holiness is wholeness, right? That we are always consistent. And so, yeah, we're all struggling. And like you said, we just need to try and pay some attention to when that's not happening. All right, so Charlotte, you get the last word, and then we'll wrap it up.
In my lifetime, 50 years ago, I dealt with people who were pretty nice folks, except they justify all that by saying, well, those Black people aren't really quite human, which is really shocking to us now.
Sure.
But I think it was common.
Yeah, and that's, I think we get into that a little more later in other sessions, and it's mentioned some here that, yeah, when you dehumanize people, they're not really human anymore, then you don't have to treat them like human beings, right? And so that's kind of part of the process of this. You can't do that unless you've dehumanized them somehow. And again, that's, we're not doing it the same way that they were then and saying people are property, but yet anytime we disagree with some other people, we tend to find ways to dehumanize them or label them and they're just this, so that's why I don't have to treat them with the same sort of respect. And so, yeah, to see each other as fully human, I think that's part of the challenge. But yeah, thanks. All right, we have one more minute. So I saw Don. Oh, Gary. All right, Gary, you have the final word. You get unmuted. Sorry, I'll let you unmute yourself. Sometimes I try and do it, and then.
Well, I was going to say, I like this question because that is the great challenge, in our lives. And I think that when somebody sits back and listens to this series or something, or looks at us 300 years later, they'll go, couldn't they see that? And we don't even know what it is. Yeah. And so I think that there's that what we're all trying to do is look now and say, where are my blind spots? Because like Heather said, we look back and we can be so harsh, and like I like what Stephen said, man, we're trying to navigate in the best way that we can, and so if you want to come to tomorrow's class, to wisdom, I'm just teasing.
Yeah, that's like we said, they all lead it. Anna Jane teaches you how to deal with conflict. I stir up a bunch of conflict, and then Gary comes off with learning about wisdom.
Conflict. It's
yeah.
but
All right.
that's where we are is consistency, and that's I just like that. question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. As I said, there was so much in that we could talk about, and I know probably there's plenty more you do want to talk about. But I encourage you to keep talking with each other, talk with me if you want to get together and do that. I'm happy to do that. So I appreciate you all being here, taking the time out to be a part of a discussion that's not easy. But like we said, it's being a whole, complete person who is consistent in thought and deed. That's the goal. None of us are there. I know I'm not. But as was mentioned, the more we're aware of that and paying attention to it, the better chance we're going to have to wholly be the people that God calls us to be. So thank you all again.